In this video, I've got some new DIY strength tests of very high bond or VHB tape alone and together with Eternabond and Dicor lap-sealant. In my original video on the strength of VHB tape for no-drill solar panel installs, I estimated the maximum shear force due to winds, then measured the 5-hour static shear strength of 3M's 5952 very high bond tape. I demonstrated that the 6 2-inch brackets holding my panel would be 24 times stronger than the worst case force of 100-mile-per-hour wind. These tests are different than my earlier static shear tests, which lasted for about 5 hours. In these tests, I'm doing more of a dynamic strength test in which the force is applied over seconds rather than hours. I now feel that the strongest forces on my solar panel are the strong but brief gusts of wind that occur in a matter of seconds when you pass a large truck at high speed. The static tests are also reassuring, but I believe the dynamic tests are more relevant. Now let's define the forces on rooftop solar panel brackets that we're talking about. Compressive forces are the weight of the panel. It alone can hold the panel if you stay below 5 or 10 miles an hour, but that's boring. Shear forces push the panel parallel to the roof surface. This is probably the strongest force. Tensile forces tend to lift the panel up due to the Bernoulli effect caused by wind blowing over the vehicle, kind of like the lift on an airplane wing. I've added one more component of force I'll label the peel force. It recognizes that the front edge wants to lift up the most, and that would cause a peeling action with the tape. In my tests, I've used aluminum angle to provide some peeling direction to the force to account for this. This is done by offsetting the pulling force to the side of the tape attachment point. So my shear tests have a tiny bit of peel force, and my tensile tests have an even greater peel force direction. How much and how relevant, I don't know. The important thing is the tests are exactly the same for each taping scenario so that the results are comparable. Here's my test rig. I attached test brackets to the side and back of my painted toolbox after light sanding with 220 grit sandpaper and cleaning with an isopropyl water mix. I got a 440-pound spring scale and used a 7-foot lever arm to apply downward pressure on each bracket, with the scale in between to measure the maximum force before it failed. I used carabiners and 1/8-inch S-hooks to attach the scale to the brackets and to the arm. I recorded the peak force with video, which was not real clear but good enough to determine the force within about plus or minus 2 pounds. Here are my test cases. The arrows show the direction of pull basically coming out of the screen. The top row are for shear tests and the bottom row are for tensile tests, with a significant peel component to the force thanks to the pulling force being on the side of the bracket rather than centered. Set 1 is the VHB tape by itself with no sealant around the bracket. All VHB tape will be 2 inches long by 1 inch wide. Set 2 is the Eternabond or EB by itself with no very high bond tape under the bracket. Set 3 has VHB under the brackets, Eternabond over them, and a little Dicor lap-sealant along the unsealed edge. I would not leave an unsealed edge where water can seep into the VHB, as I see in many videos. Set 4 has VHB under the brackets, Dicor lap-sealant all the way around each bracket, and Eternabond tape over that. This simulates the common case where people find cracks in the lap-sealant after a few years and use Eternabond over the top to reseal it, rather than scraping it off and starting over. I have one final scenario. This one tested only in a shear test. It has Dicor lap sealant only and only along one edge, just to see what that adds to my test set number 3, where I use Dicor to seal that untaped edge that sits under the panel. Okay, here are the tests. I'll show a freeze frame at the peak force just before failure, since the maximums are hard to see in the videos. Here is the spring scale again, with 100 through 400 pound marks highlighted for reference. First up is shear test number 1, 2 inches of VHB tape only. 134 pounds. Okay, shear test number 2 with the Eternabond tape only. Okay, it hit a peak and then it just started stretching. The max was 60 pounds. This is shear test number 3, very high bond tape plus Eternabond over the bracket and Dicor lap sealant along only the unsealed edge of the bracket. £210. Shear test number 4 has VHB, Dicor, and Eternabond on top. The peak was 250 pounds. But wait, what just happened? After the test, the scale was hanging by the black bungee that keeps it from hitting the floor. And my bracket is still taped to the box. Holy sh**. It broke the test rig. Let's slow it down and see what happened. Here's the moment of failure. But what's this? Well, I found that on the floor. It was an 1/8-inch steel S-hook that I used to hang the scale, and it just bent open. So the maximum force held by the tape must be greater than 250 pounds. I redid the test with a much stronger carabiner, but I assume it was weakened in the first test run, and it did not quite reach 250 pounds the second time. Unfortunately, I failed to turn the camera on the second time. Anyway, this combination of 2 inches of VHB tape with both Eternabond and Dicor lap sealant withstood a shear force of at least 250 pounds. Okay, this is the lap sealant only on one edge. Not expected to have much strength, but we need to see what it contributes to the other tests. Okay, it looks like 0-0. It only held 8.2 pounds. I'll put the rest of the tests after the end of this video if you want to see all of them. But in the interest of time, let's look at the results. Set number 1 was 3M VHB tape alone, and it took 134 pounds of shear force to pull it off, and about the same for the tensile force. Set number 2 was Eternabond only, and it pulled like taffy with a peak force of only 60 pounds for the shear test and the tensile test. Notice Eternabond has no sudden release like VHB, just a slow stretching. This tells me its molecules flow past one another and are not chemically cross-linked like the VHB tapes. This makes them a great sealant, but not good for a standalone strong attachment. So I wouldn't use it alone, only as a sealant over a VHB attachment. Set number 3 suggests that Eternabond adds to the VHB strength under a shear load, but does not add much under a tensile load. Set number 4 shows that putting Eternabond over an old VHB and lap-sealed bracket to rehab it can be very strong against a shear load, but not add much against a tensile force. Testing variability with a crude DIY rig may be an issue with the low tensile strength in set 4, but sets 1 and 2 indicate repeatability is not too bad. So I'm not sure what went on with the tensile test in set 4. Finally, test set number 5 suggests that aging Dicor lap-sealant may have added about 8 pounds per edge, or 32 pounds for all 4 edges, to test set number 4 shear strength. This rehab scenario with Eternabond over old lap-sealant was the strongest scenario at 250 pounds or 1,500 pounds for all 6 brackets. Hundreds of times the worst case estimated wind load shear force of 4.4 pounds. What about long-term durability of these tapes and fatigue over many cycles? My experience is that VHB tape has held my panel firmly for 5 years, but the Dicor lap-sealant is showing some micro cracks, and I need to do something about that. I just covered my brackets and the aging Dicor with Eternabond tape. Really easy because you don't have to scrape off the old Dicor. 3M has a technical data sheet on VHB durability that is a little more convincing. Here are some excerpts. First, 3M has done outdoor aging tests for 5 years in Florida, Arizona, and Minnesota, and found no degradation in strength. Here's the data for Minnesota. Second, VHB tapes are used to attach the outer aluminum panels to ambulance bodies and endure years of rugged service. And finally, 3M attached all the exterior panels and doors to a full-size semi-truck and drove it for 300,000 simulated miles, whatever that means. And the VHB tape bonds remain completely intact. Wow. On that note, let's look at Eternabond durability as a sealant. We know Dicor lap-sealant degrades in a few years, although I still like it to seal the edges that may be missed by Eternabond tape. After considerable research and seeing many undocumented claims for Eternabond durability, I found this on its manufacturer's blog page. They say that Eternabond stays flexible for up to 35 years, has a life expectancy of over 25 years, and a 15-year warranty. I don't think I'll worry about my no-drill solar install for many years to come. Finally, what about cost? Let's look at just the tapes used in my install and later sealing with Eternabond for my 6 2-inch brackets. The 3M VHB tape is currently about $14 for a 15-foot roll, or about 8 cents an inch. So the total for the 12 inches I used was about $1 US. The 4-inch wide Eternabond tape overlaps 2 inches on each side of each 2-inch bracket, so it takes 6 inches per bracket, and I've paid $13.50 to $19 US for 10-foot rolls. So for my 6 brackets, the cost range is $4 to $6 US. And adding the cost of the 2 tapes together gives me a total tape cost of $5 to $7 US. So it's really not that expensive. Let's summarize what we've learned. First, VHB tape sealed with Eternabond sealant tape is very strong, withstanding loads of 850 to 1,200 pounds for 6 2-inch brackets. One caveat though, this no-drill approach is not for roll-on roof coatings, only hard, smooth surfaces with proper preparation. Next, Eternabond over old VHB and lap-sealed brackets, where the lap sealant is aging, can be even stronger. And number 4, a VHB and Eternabond solar install should last for many miles and many years, probably at least 10 to 15 years if prepped and applied properly. Thanks much for tuning in. I'm adding some supplemental information at the end in case you're interested. Okay, now on to the tensile stress test. Okay, test number 1, very high bond tape. The maximum was 132 pounds. Okay, this is the tensile test, number 2, Eternabond only. Stretching, but didn't release. The peak was 60 pounds, just like the shear test. Test 3, VHB plus EB. The peak is 142 pounds. And test 4, VHB plus Dicor plus EB. The peak is 120 pounds. Now let's compare our VHB numbers to 3M data from their November 2015 technical data sheet for VHB tape number 5952. Their results are per square inch, and mine are for 2-inch pieces of tape. So if I divide mine by 2, I get 67 pounds per square inch for the shear test in comparison to 3M's value of 80 pounds per square inch. So mine is 16% lower, and my tensile test is 27% lower. But look at the 3M value for peel adhesion, which is in terms of pounds per linear inch. It is much lower, and I believe the slight peel component that I built into my tests by pulling them off center with angle brackets to better reflect the forces on a solar panel probably explains much of this difference. So I would say my numbers may be more realistic, and they are certainly more conservative. However, the peel component is really unknown, and the DIY rig in my garage is way different than 3M's testing lab, so we shouldn't speculate too far. I get some great ideas from viewers. Here are 2 that are worth mentioning. The first good idea was, why not use a rail that runs the length of the supported sides instead of the 6 little 2-inch feet? Well, this seemed like a good idea, so I tried a 10-inch rail to compare to my 2-inch brackets. It has 10 inches of VHB tape, 1 inch wide, and Eternabond tape along both sides of an aluminum angle section. To make a long story short, I broke my rig 4 times trying to pull that rail off. After repeated pulls, which probably weakened it, I pegged the scale and the rail finally came off. So at least 440 pounds force per 10 inches of rail, probably closer to 500 pounds to pull that sucker off. So if your panel is 40 inches long like mine, and you use tape to secure 2 40-inch rails, or say angle aluminum pieces, it could take 4,000 pounds of force to pull that panel off. That's 2 Tons. Wow. A final note. The 10-inch rail was much stronger, but on a per-inch basis, not so much. I believe this is due to repeated tests on the same 10-inch rail, which may have weakened it, and to pegging the scale, so I really don't have a peak value. It was likely much higher. The other good idea was put a wind deflector in front of the solar panels. This will stop the wind shear. I think this is a good idea, especially if you're still worried about the wind shear, although it won't prevent vertical lift, but that is probably a weaker force. However, now that I know that my 6 brackets can withstand over 1,200 pounds of force, I'm not worried so much anymore, and I probably won't add a deflector to my current setup. I like the idea, though.